everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 8th, devotional, Matthew 18:21 through 35. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, Be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged of me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In his anger, his master hanged him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. A Lost Lady, Chapter 3. For the next few years, Neil saw very little of Mrs. Forrester. She was an excitement that came and went with summer. She and her husband always spent the winter in Denver and Colorado Springs, left Sweetwater soon after Thanksgiving, and did not return until the 1st of May. He knew that Mrs. Forrester liked him, but she hadn't much time for grown boys. When she had friends staying with her and gave a picnic supper for them or a dance in the grove on a moonlight night, Neil was always invited. Coming and going along the road to the marsh with the Bloom boys, he sometimes met the captain driving visitors over in the Democrat wagon. And he heard about these people from Black Tom, Judge Pomeroy's faithful Negro servant, who went over to wait on the table for Mrs. Forrester when she had a dinner party. Then came the accident which cut short the captain's career as a road builder. After that fall with his horse, he lay ill at the Antlers in Colorado Springs all winter. In the summer, when Mrs. Forrester brought him home to Sweetwater, he still walked with a cane. He had grown much heavier, seemed unencumbered by his own bulk, and never suggested taking a contract for the railroad again. He was able to work in his garden, trimmed his snowball bushes and lilac hedges, devoted a great deal of time to growing roses. He and his wife still went away for the winter, but each year the period of their absence grew shorter. All this while the town of Sweetwater was changing. Its future no longer looked bright. Successive crop failures had broken the spirit of the farmers. George Adams and his family had gone back to Massachusetts, disillusioned by the West. One by one, the other gentlemen ranchers followed their example. The Forresters now had fewer visitors. The Burlington was drawing in its horns, as people said, and the railroad officials were not stopping off at Sweetwater so often, were more inclined to hurry past the town where they had sunk money that would never come back. Neil Herbert's father was one of the first failures to be crowded to the wall. He closed his little house, sent his cousin Sadie back to Kentucky, and went to Denver to accept an office position. He left Neil behind to read law in the office with his uncle. Not that Neil had any taste for the law, but he liked being with Judge Pomeroy, and he might as well stay there as anywhere for the present. The few $1,000s his mother had left him would not be his until he was 21. Neil fitted up a room for himself behind the suite which the judge retained for his law offices on the second floor of the most pretentious brick block in town. There he lived with monastic cleanness and severity, glad to be rid of his cousin and her inconsequential housewifery, and resolved to remain a bachelor like his uncle. He took care of the offices, which meant that he did the janitor work, arranged them exactly to suit his taste, making the room so attractive that all the judge's friends, and especially Captain Forrester, dropped in there to talk oftener than ever. The judge was proud of his nephew. Neil was now 19, a tall, straight, deliberate boy. His features were clear-cut, his gray eyes, so dark that they looked black under his long lashes, were rather moody and challenging. The world did not seem over-bright to young people just then. His reserve, which did not come from embarrassment or vanity, but from a critical habit of mind, made him seem older than he was and a little cold. One afternoon, only a few days before Christmas, Neil sat writing in the back office, at the long table where he usually worked or trifled, surrounded by the judge's fine law library and solemn steel engravings of statesmen and jurists. His uncle was at his desk in the front office, engaged in a friendly consultation with one of his country clients. Neil, greatly bored with the notes he was copying, was trying to invent an excuse for getting out on the street when he became aware of light footsteps coming rapidly down the outside corridor. The door of the front office opened. He heard his uncle rise quickly to his feet, and at the same moment heard a woman's laugh, a soft, musical laugh which rose and descended like a suave scale. He turned in his screw chair so that he could look over his shoulder through the double doors into the front room. Mrs. Forrester stood there, shaking her muff at the judge and the bewildered Swede farmer. Her quick eye lighted upon a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses on the desk among the papers. "Is that the way you prepare your cases, Judge? What an example for Neil!" She peeped through the door and nodded to the boy as he rose. He remained in the back room, however, watching her, while she declined the chair the judge pushed toward her and made a sign of refusal when he politely pointed to the bourbon. She stood beside his desk in her long sealskin coat and cap, a crimson scarf showing above the collar, and a little brown veil with spots tied over her eyes. The veil did not in the least obscure those beautiful eyes, dark and full of light, set upon a low white forehead and arching eyebrows. The frosty air had brought no color to her cheeks. Her skin had always the fragrant, crystalline whiteness of white lilacs. Mrs. Forrester looked at one, and one knew that she was bewitching. It was instantaneous, and it pierced the thickest hide. The Swede farmer was now grinning from ear to ear, and he too had shuffled to his feet. There could be no negative encounter, however slight, with Mrs. Forrester. If she merely bowed to you, merely looked at you, it constituted a personal relation. Something about her took hold of one in a flash. One became acutely conscious of her frailty and grace, of her mouth which could say so much without words, of her eyes, lively, laughing, intimate, nearly always a little mocking. "Will you and Neil dine with us tomorrow evening, Judge? And will you lend me Tom? We've just had a wire. The Ogdens are stopping over with us. They've been east to bring the girl home from school. She had mumps or something. They want to get home for Christmas, but they will stop off for 2 days. Probably Frank Ellinger will come down from Denver." "No prospect can afford me such pleasure as that of dining with Mrs. Forrester," said the judge ponderously. "Thank you." She bowed playfully and turned towards the double doors. "Neil, could you leave your work long enough to drive me home? Mr. Forrester has been detained at the bank." Neil put on his wolfskin coat. Mrs. Forrester took him by his shaggy sleeve and went with him quickly down the long corridor and the narrow stairs to the street. At the hitch bar stood her cutter, looking like a painted toy among the country sleds and wagons. Neil took the buffalo robes about Mrs. Forrester and tied the ponies and sprang in beside her. Without direction, the team started down the frozen main street where few people were abroad, crossed this creek on the ice, and trotted up the poplar-bordered lane toward the house on the hill. The afternoon sun burned on the snow-crusted pastures. The poplars looked very tall and straight, pinched up and severe in their winter poverty. Mrs. Forrester chatted to Neil with her face turned toward him, holding her muff up to break the wind. "I'm counting on you to help me entertain Constance Ogden. Can you take her off my hands the day after tomorrow and come over in the afternoon? Your duties as a lawyer aren't very arduous yet." She smiled teasingly. "What can I do with a miss of 19, one who goes to college? I've no learned conversation for her." "Surely I haven't," Neil exclaimed. "Oh, but you're a boy. Perhaps you can interest her in the lighter things. She's considered pretty." "Do you think she is?" "I haven't seen her lately. She was striking, china blue eyes and heaps of yellow hair. Not exactly yellow, what they call an ashen blonde, I believe." Neil had noticed that in describing the charms of other women, Mrs. Forrester always made fun of them a little. They drew up in front of the house. Ben Keyser came around from the kitchen to take the tea. "You're to go back for Mr. Forrester at 6, Ben. Neil, come in for a moment and get warm." She drew him through the little storm entry, which protected the front door in winter, into the hall. "Hang up your coat and come along." He followed her through the parlor into the sitting room, where a little coal grate was burning under the black mantelpiece, and sat down in the big leather chair in which Captain Forrester dozed after his midday meal. It was rather a dark room, with walnut bookcases that have carved tops and glass doors. The floor was covered by a red carpet, and the walls were hung with large, old-fashioned engravings, the house of the poet of the last day of Pompeii, Shakespeare reading before Queen Elizabeth. Mrs. Forrester left him, and presently returned carrying a tray with a decanter and a sherry glasses. She put it down on her husband's smoking table, poured out a glass for Neil and one for herself, and perched on the arm of one of the stuffed chairs, where she sat sipping her sherry and stretching her tiny silver-buckled slippers out towards the glowing coals. "It's so nice to have you staying on until after Christmas," Neil observed. "You've only been here one other Christmas since I can remember." "I'm afraid we're staying on all winter this year. Mr. Forster thinks we can't afford to go away. For some reason we are extraordinarily poor just now." "Like everybody else," the boy commented grimly. "Yes, like everybody else. However, it does no good to be glum about it, does it?" She refilled the 2 glasses. "I always take a little sherry at this time in the afternoon. At Colorado Springs some of my friends take tea like the English, but I feel like an old woman drinking tea. Besides, sherry is good for my throat." Neil remembered some legend about a weak chest and occasional terrifying hemorrhages, but that seemed doubtful as one looked at her, fragile indeed, but with such light, effervescing vitality. "Perhaps I do seem old to you, Neil, quite old enough for tea and a cap." He smiled gravely. "You always seem the same to me, Mrs. Forster." "Yeah, and how is that?" "Lovely, just lovely." As she bent forward to put down her glass, she patted his cheek. "Oh, you'll do very, very well for Constance." Then seriously, "I'm glad. If I do, though, I want you to like me well enough to come to see us often this winter. You shall come with your uncle to make forth at whist. Mr. Forster must have his whist in the evening. Do you think he is looking any worse, Neil? It frightens me to see him getting a little uncertain. But there, we must believe in good luck." She took up the half-empty glass and held it against the light. Neil liked to see the firelight sparkle on her earrings, long pendants of garnets, and seed pearls in the shape of fleur-de-lis. She was the only woman he knew who wore earrings. They hung naturally against her thin, triangular cheeks. Captain Forrester, although he had given her handsomer ones, liked to see her wear these because they had been his mother's. It gratified him to have his wife wear jewels, and it meant something to him. She never left off her beautiful rings unless she was in the kitchen. "A winter in the country may do him good," said Mrs. Forrester, after a silence during which she looked intently into the fire, as if she was trying to read the outcome of their difficulties there. "He loves this place so much, but you and Judge Pomeroy must keep an eye on him when he is in town, Neil. If he looks tired or uncertain, make some excuse and bring him home. He can't carry a drink or two as he used." She glanced over her shoulder to see that the door into the dining room was shut. "Once last winter he had been drinking with some old friends at the Antlers. Nothing unusual, just as he always did, as a man must be able to do. But it was too much for him. When he came out to join me in the carriage, coming down that long walk, he fell. There was no ice. He didn't slip. It was simply because he was unsteady. He had trouble getting up. I still shiver to think of it. To me, it was as if one of the mountains had fallen down." A little later, Neil went plunging down the hill, looking exultantly into the streak of the red sunset. Oh, the winter would not be so bad this year. How strange that she should be here at all. A woman like her among common people. Not even in Denver had he ever seen another woman so elegant. He had sat in the dining room of the Brown Palace Hotel and watched them as they came down to dinner, fashionable women from the East on their way to California. But he had never found one so attractive and distinguished as Mrs. Forster. Compared with her, other women were heavy and dull. Even the pretty ones seemed lifeless. They had not that something in their glance that made one's blood tingle. And never elsewhere had he heard anything like her inviting musical laugh that was like the distant measures of dance music heard through opening and shutting doors. He could remember the very first time he ever saw Mrs. Forster when he was a little boy. He had been loitering in front of the Episcopal Church on Sunday morning when a low carriage drove up the door. Ben Keyser was on the front seat, and in the back seat was a lady alone in a black silk dress, all puffs and ruffles, and a black hat. carrying a parasol with a carved ivory handle. As the carriage stopped, she lifted her dress to alight. Out of a swirl of foamy white petticoats, she thrust a black, shiny slipper. She stepped lightly to the ground and with a nod to the driver went into the church. The little boy followed her through the open door, saw her enter a pew and kneel. He was proud now. At that first moment he had recognized her as belonging to a different world from any he had ever known. Neil paused for a moment at the end of the lane to look up the last skeleton poplar in the long road. Just above its pointed tip hung the hollow, silver-white winter moon. Chapter 4. In pleasant weather, Judge Pomeroy walked to the Foresters', but on the occasion of the dinner for the Ogdens, he engaged a liveryman to take him and his nephew over in one of the town hacks, vehicles seldom used except for funerals and weddings. They smelled strongly of the stable and contained lap robes as heavy as lead and as slippery as oiled paper. Neil and his uncle were the only townspeople asked to the Foresters' that evening. They rolled over the creek and up the hill in state and emerged covered with horsehair. Captain Forrester met them at the door, his burly figure buttoned up in a frock coat, a flat collar, and black string tie under the heavy folds of his neck. He was always clean-shaven except for a drooping, dun-colored mustache. The company stood behind him laughing while Neil caught up the whisk broom and began dusting roan hairs off his uncle's broadcloth. Mrs. Forrester gave Neil a brushing in turn and then took him into the parlor and introduced him to Mrs. Ogden and her daughter. The daughter was a rather pretty girl, Neil thought, in a pale pink evening dress which left bare her smooth arms and short dimpled neck. Her eyes were, as Mrs. Forrester had said, a china blue, rather prominent and inexpressive. Her fleece of ashy gold hair was bound about her head with silver bands. In spite of her fresh, rose-like complexion, her face was not altogether agreeable. Two dissatisfied lines reached from the corners of her short nose to the corners of her mouth. When she was displeased even a little, these lines tightened, drew her nose back, and gave her a suspicious, injured expression. Neil sat down by her and did his best, but he found her hard to talk to. She seemed nervous and distracted, kept glancing over her shoulder and crushing her handkerchief up in her hands. Her mind clearly was elsewhere. After a few moments he turned to the mother, who was more easily interested. Mrs. Ogden was almost unpardonably homely. She had a pear-shaped face, and across her high forehead lay a row of flat, dry curls. Her bluish-brown skin was almost the color of her violet dinner dress. A diamond necklace glittered about her wrinkled throat. Unlike Constance, she seemed thoroughly amiable, but as she talked, she tilted her head and used her eyes, availing herself for those arch glances which he had supposedly only pretty women indulged in. Probably she had long been surrounded by people to whom she was an important personage, and had acquired the manner of the spoiled darling. Neil thought her rather foolish at first, but in moments he had got used to her mannerisms and began to like her. He found himself laughing heartily and forgot the discouragement of his failure and with the daughter. Mr. Ogden, a short, weather-beaten man of 50, with a cast in one eye, a stiff imperial, and twisted mustaches, was noticeably quieter and less expansive than when Neil had met him here on former occasions. He seemed to expect his wife to do the talking. When Mrs. Forrester addressed him or passed near him, his good eye twinkled and followed her, while the eye that looked askance remained unchanged and committed itself to nothing. Suddenly everyone became more lively, the air warmed, and the lamplight seemed to brighten, as the fourth member of the Denver party came in from the dining room with a glittery tray full of cocktails he had been making. Frank Ellinger was a bachelor of 40, 6 feet 2, with long straight legs, fine shoulders, and a figure that still permeated his white waistcoat to button without a wrinkle under his conspicuously well-cut dinner coat. His black hair, coarse and curly as the filling of a mattress, was gray about the ears. His florid face showed little purple veins about his big nose, a nose like the prow of a ship with long nostrils. His chin was deeply cleft. His thick curly lips seemed very, very muscular, very much under his control, and with his strong white teeth, irregular and curved, gave him the look of a man who could bite an iron rod in two with the snap of his jaws. His whole figure seemed very much alive under his clothes, with restless, muscular energy that had something of the cruelty of wild animals in it. Neil was very much interested in this man, the hero of many ambiguous stories. He didn't know whether he liked him or not. He knew nothing bad about him, but he felt something evil. The cocktails were the signal for the general conversation. The company drew together in one group. Even Mrs. Constance seemed less dissatisfied. Ellinger drank his cocktail standing beside her chair and offered her the cherry in his glass. They were the old-fashioned whiskey cocktails. Nobody drank martinis then. Gin was supposed to be the consolation of sailors and inebriate scrub women. "Very good, Frank, very good," Captain Forrester pronounced, drawing out a fresh cologne-scented handkerchief to wipe his mustache. "Are encores in order?" The captain puffed slightly when he talked. His eyes, always somewhat suffused with bloodshot since his injury, blinked at his friends from under his heavy lids. "One more round for everybody, Captain." Ellinger brought in from the sideboard a capacious shaker and refilled all the glasses except Mrs. Ogden's as he shook his finger and offered her the little dish of maraschino cherries. "No, I don't want those. I want the one in your glass," she said with a pouty smile. "I like it to taste of something." "Constance," said her mother reprovingly, rolling her eyes at Mrs. Forrester as to share with her charm of the such innocent. "Neil," Mrs. Forrester laughed, "won't you give the child your cherry too?" Neil promptly crossed the room, proffered the cherry at the bottom of his glass. She took it with her thumb and forefinger and dropped it into her own, where he was quick to observe she left it when they went out to dinner. A stubborn piece of pink flesh, he decided, and certainly a fool about a man quite old enough to be her father. He sighed when he saw that he was placed next to her at the dinner table. Captain Forrester still made a commanding figure at the head of his own table, with his napkin tucked under his chin and the work of carving well in hand. Nobody could lay bare the bones of a brace of a duck or a 20-pound turkey more deftly. "What part of the turkey do you prefer, Mrs. Ogden?" If one had a preference, it was gratified, with all the stuffing and gravy that went with it, and the vegetables properly placed. When a plate left Captain Forrester's hands, it was a dinner. The recipient was served, and well served. He served Mrs. Forrester last of the ladies, but before the men, and to her too he said, "Mrs. Forrester, what part of the turkey shall I give you this evening?" He was a man who did not vary his formula or his manners. He was no more mobile than his countenance. Neil and Judge Pomeroy often remarked how much Captain Forrester looked like the pictures of Grover Cleveland. His clumsy dignity covered a deep nature and a conscience that was never been juggled with. His repose was like that of a mountain. When he laid his fleshly, thick-fingered hand upon a frantic horse, an hysterical woman, an Irishman workman out of the blood, he brought them peace, something they could not resist. That had been the secret of his management of men. His sanity asked nothing, claimed nothing, and was so simple that it brought a hush over the distracted creatures. In the old days, when he was building road in the Black Hills, trouble sometimes broke out in camp when he was absent, staying with Mrs. Forrester at Colorado Springs. He would put down the telegram that announced an insurrection and said to his wife, "Matey, I must go to the men," and that's what he did. He went to them. While the captain was intent upon his duties as the host, he talked very little, and Judge Pomeroy and Ellinger kept a lively crossfire of amusing stories going. Neil, sitting opposite Ellinger, watched him closely. He still couldn't decide whether he liked him or not. In Denver, Frank was known as the Prince of Good Fellows, a tactful, generous, resourceful, though apt to trim his sails to the wind, a man who good-humoredly bowed to the inevitable or the almost inevitable. He had, when he was younger, been notoriously wild, but that was not held against him even by mothers with marriageable daughters like Mrs. Ogden. Morals were different in those days. Neil had heard his uncle refer to Ellinger's youthful infatuation with a woman called Nell Emerald, a handsome and rather unusual woman who conducted a house properly licensed by the Denver police. Nell Emerald had told an old club man that though she had been out behind young Ellinger's new trotting horse, she had no respect for a man who could go driving with a prostitute in broad daylight. This story and a dozen like it were often related of Ellinger, and the women laughed over them as heartily as the men. All the while that he was making a scandalous chronicle for himself, young Ellinger had been devotedly caring for an invalid mother, and he was described to strangers as a terribly fast young man and a model son. That combination pleased the taste of the time. Nobody thought the worst of him. Now that his mother was dead, he lived at the Brown Palace Hotel, though he still kept your house at Colorado Springs. When the roast was well under way, Black Tom, very formal in a white waistcoat and high collar, poured the champagne. Captain Forrester lifted his glass, the frill stem behind his thick fingers, and glancing around the table at his guests and Mrs. Forrester, said, "Happy days." It was the toast he always drank at dinner, the invocation he was sure to utter when he had a glass of whiskey with an old friend. Whoever had heard him say it once liked to hear him say it again. Nobody else could utter those two words as he did, with such gravity and high courtesy. It seemed a solemn moment seemed to knock at the door of fate, behind which all days, happy and otherwise, were hidden. Neil drank his wine with a pleasant shiver, thinking that nothing else made life seem so precarious, the future so cryptic and unfathomable as the brief toast uttered by that massive man, "Happy days." Mrs. Ogden turned to the host with her most languishing smile. "Captain Forrester, I want you to tell Constance." She was an East Virginia woman, and what she really said was, "Captain Forrester, all you need to tell," etc. Her vowels seemed to roll about the same way her eyes did. "I want you to tell Constance about how you found this lovely spot way back in the Indian times." The captain looked down at the table between the candles at Mrs. Forrester, as if to consult her. She smiled and nodded, and her beautiful earrings swung beside her pale cheeks. She was wearing her diamonds tonight and a black velvet gown. Her husband had archaic ideas about jewels. A man bought them for his wife in acknowledgment of things that he could not gracefully utter. They must be costly. They must show that he was able to buy them and that she was worthy to wear them. With her approval, the captain began his narrative, a concise account of how he came west, a young boy, after serving in the Civil War, and took a job as a driver for a freighting company that carried supplies across the plains from Nebraska City to Cherry Creek, as Denver was then called. The freighters, after embarking in that sea of grass 600 miles in width, lost all count of the days of the week and the month. One day was like another, and all were glorious, good hunting, plenty of antelope and buffalo, boundless sunny sky, boundless plains of waving grass, long freshwater lagoons yellow with lagoon flowers, where the bison in their periodic migrations stopped to drink, bathe, and wallow. "An ideal life for a young man," the captain pronounced. Once, when he was driven out of the trail by a washout, he rode south on his horse to explore and found an Indian encampment near the Sweetwater. On this very hill where his house now stood. He was, he said, greatly taken with the location, and made up his mind that he would one day have a house there. He cut down a young willow tree and drove the stake in the ground to mark the spot where he wished to build. He went away and did not come back for many years. He was helping to lay the first railroad across the plains. "There were those that were dependent on me," he said. "I had sickness to contend with and responsibilities. But in those years I expect there was hardly a day passed that I did not remember the Sweetwater and this hill. When I came here a young man, I had planned it in my mind pretty much as it is today, where I would dig my well, and where I would plant my grove and my orchard. I planned to build a house that my friends could come to, with a wife like Mrs. Forrester to make it attractive to them. I used to promise myself that some day I would manage it." This part of the story the captain told not with embarrassment but with reserve, choosing his words slowly, absently cracking English walnuts with his strong fingers, and heaping a little hoard of kernels beside his plate. His friends understood that he was referring to his first marriage, to the poor invalid wife who had not ever been happy and who had kept his nose to the grindstone. "When things looked most discouraging," he went on, "I came back here once and bought the place from the railroad company. They took my note. I found my willow stake. It had rooted and grown into a tree, and I planted 3 more there to mark the corners of my house. 12 years later, Mrs. Forrester came here with me shortly after our marriage, and we built our house." Captain Forrester puffed from time to time, but his clear account commanded attention. Something in the way he uttered his unornamented phrases gave them the impressiveness of inscriptions cut in stone. Mrs. Forrester nodded at him from her end of the table. "And now tell us your philosophy of life. This is where it comes in," she laughed teasingly. The captain coughed and looked abashed. "I was intending to admit that tonight. Some of our guests have already heard it." No, it belongs at the end of the story. And if some of us have heard it, we can hear it again. Go on." Well, then, my philosophy is that what you think of and plan for day by day, in spite of yourself, so to speak, you will get. You will get it more or less. That is, unless you're one of those people who get nothing in this world. There are such people. I have lived too much in mining works and construction camps not to know that. He paused, as if, though this was too dark a chapter to be going into, it must have its place, its moment of silent recognition. If you are not one of those, Constance and Neil, will you accomplish what you dream of most? And why? That's the interesting part of it, his wife prompted him. Because, he roused himself from his abstraction and looked at the company, because a thing that is dreamed of in the way, is already an accomplished fact. All our great West has been developed from such dreams. The homesteaders and the prospectors and the contractors. We dreamed the railroads across the mountains, such as I dreamed my place on Sweetwater. All these things will be everyday facts to the coming generation, but to us, Captain Forrester ended with a sort of grunt. Something forbidden had come into his voice, the lonely, defiant note that is so often heard in the voices of old Indians. Mistress Ogden had listened to the story with such sympathy that Neil liked her better than ever, and even the preoccupied Constance seemed able to give it to her attention. They rose from the dessert and went into the parlor to arrange the card tables. The captain still played whist as well as ever, and he brought out a box of his best cigars. He paused before Mrs. Ogden and said, "Is smoke offensive to you, Mrs. Ogden?" When she protested that it was not, he crossed the room to where Constance was talking with Ellinger and asked the same grave courtesy, "Is smoke offensive to you, Constance?" Had there been half a dozen young women present, he would have asked that question of each, probably in the same words. It did not bother him to repeat a phrase. If an expression answered his purpose, he saw no reason for varying it. Mrs. Forrester and Mr. Ogden were to play against Mrs. Ogden and the captain. "Constance," said Mrs. Forrester as she sat down, "will you play with Neil? I'm told he's very good." Mrs. Ogden's short nose flicked up, the lines on either side of it deepened, and she again looked injured. Neil was sure she detested him. He was not going to be done in by her. "Miss Ogden," he said. He stood beside his chair, deliberately shuffling a pack of cards. "My uncle are used to playing together. Probably you are used to playing with Mr. Ellinger. Suppose we try that combination." She gave him a quick, suspicious glance from under her yellow eyelashes and flung herself into a chair without so much as answering him. Frank Ellinger came in from the dining room where he had been sampling the captain's French brandy and took a vacant seat opposite Miss Ogden. "So it's you and me, Connie? Good enough," he explained, cutting the pack Neil pushed toward him. Just before midnight, Black Tom opened the door and announced that the eggnog was ready. The card players went into the dining room where the punch bowl stood smoking on the table. "Constance," said Captain Forrester, "do you sing? I'd like to hear one of the old songs with the eggnog." "I'm sorry, Captain Forrester, I really haven't any voice." Neil noticed that whenever Constance spoke to the captain, she strained her throat, though he wasn't in the least deaf. He broke in over her refusal. "Uncle can start a song if you coax him, sir." Judge Pomeroy, after smoothing his silver whiskers and coughing, began Auld Lang Syne. The others joined in, but they hadn't got to the end of it when a hollow rumbling down on the ridge made them laugh, and everyone ran to the front windows to see the judge's funeral coach come lurching up the hill, with only one of the side lanterns lit. Mrs. Forrester sent Tom out with a drink for the driver. While Neil and his uncle were putting on their overcoats in the hall, she came up to him and whispered coaxingly to the boy, "Remember, you are coming over tomorrow at 2. I'm planning a drive, and I want you to amuse Constance for me." Neil bit his lip and looked down into Mrs. Forrester's laughing, persuasive eyes. "I'll do it for you, but that's the only reason," he said threateningly. "I understand. For me, I'll credit it to your account." The judge and his nephew rolled away on swaying springs. The Ogdens retired to their rooms upstairs. Mrs. Forrester went to help the captain divest himself of his frock coat and put it away for him. Ever since he was hurt, he had been propped high on pillows at night, and he slept in a narrow iron bed in the alcove which had formerly been his wife's dressing room. While he was undressing, he breathed heavily and sighed as if he was very tired. He fumbled with his studs and then blew on his fingers and tried again. His wife came to his aid and quickly unbuttoned everything. He did not thank her in words, but submitted gratefully. When the iron bed creaked at receiving his heavy figure, she called from the big bedroom, "Good night, Mr. Forrester," and drew the heavy curtains that shut off the alcove. She took off her rings and earrings and was beginning to unfasten her black velvet bodice when, at a tinkle of glass from without, she stopped short. Rehooking the shoulder of her gown, she went to the dining room, now faintly lit by the coal fire in the back parlor. Frank Ellinger was standing at the sideboard taking a nightcap. The Forrester French brandy was old and heavy like a cordial. "Be careful," she murmured as she approached him. "I have a distinct impression that there is someone on the enclosed stairway. There is a wide crack in the door. Ah, but kittens have claws these days. Pour me just a little, thank you. I'll have mine in by the fire." He followed her into the next room, where she stood by the grate, looking at him in the light of the pale blue flames that ran over the fresh coal put on to keep the fire. You've had a good many brandies, Frank," she said, studying his flushed, masterful face. "Not too many. I'll need them tonight," he said meaningly. She nervously brushed back a lock of her hair that came down a little. "It's not tonight, it's morning. Go to bed and sleep as late as you please. Take care, I heard silk stockings on the stairs. Good night." She put her hand on the sleeve of his coat. The white fingers clung to the black cloth as bits of paper cling to magnetized iron. Her touch, soft as it was, went through the man, all the feet and inches of him. His broad shoulders lifted on a deep breath. He looked down at her. Her eyes fell. "Good night," she said faintly. As she turned quickly away, the train of her velvet dress caught the leg of his broadcloth trousers and dragged with a friction that crackled and threw sparks. Both started. They stood looking at each other for a moment before she actually slipped through the door. Ellinger remained by the hearth, his arms folded tight over his chest, his curly lips compressed, frowning into the fire. And that's the end of chapter 4.